He didn't even lower his voice. He leaned into the microphone, smiled, and said it clearly enough for every camera to catch. Let's be honest for a moment. Evelyn isn't a leader. She's not inspiring. She's not memorable. She's the kind of person who hides behind spreadsheets because numbers don't talk back. A chuckle rippled through the room. He waited for it, then continued. She calls herself intelligent, but intelligence without charm is just noise. Without presence, it's useless. And without vision, it's embarrassing. More laughter, louder this time. She's 36 years old and still hasn't figured out how the real world works. That's why she will never run this company. Frankly, he shrugged, she doesn't even deserve to carry the Holloway name. That's when they laughed. Not awkward laughter, not sympathy, real laughter. People leaned toward each other. Someone near the stage actually clapped. I stood there, under the lights of the Silvermont Grand Hotel, feeling my last name stripped off me sentence by sentence. That was the hook. That was the moment my father decided my humiliation would be the evening's entertainment. The ballroom looked unreal, like something staged for television. Crystal chandeliers, white linen tables, champagne flowing like water. This was the 40th anniversary of Northvale Holdings, and Manhattan's elite had shown up dressed to be remembered. Investors, politicians, media, everyone who mattered, everyone except me. I had arrived early, I always did. I stood where I was told to stand, smiled when expected, stayed quiet like I'd been trained. For years, silence had been my survival skill. Tonight, it was my costume. Richard Holloway stood center stage, confident, commanding, soaking in the attention like oxygen. This was his natural habitat. Power loved him back. When he announced Brandon as his successor, the room erupted. Brandon stepped forward, polished and rehearsed, accepting praise he hadn't earned. My stepmother Marissa wiped a fake tear from her eye, gripping his arm like she'd personally built the empire herself. I watched all of it calmly. From the outside, I probably looked unaffected. On the inside, something cold and precise was locking into place. Then my father turned toward me. I felt it before it happened. The shift in energy, the pause. He wanted silence. He wanted anticipation. He wanted a punchline. And then there's my daughter, he said, pointing. Evelyn. Cameras swung in my direction. She's been around the company her whole life, he continued, and somehow learned nothing that actually matters. Laughter bubbled again. She thinks running models and balancing sheets makes her important. But business isn't about hiding in rooms alone with a calculator. It's about presence, confidence, authority. He shook his head slowly. Things she's never had, and never will. Someone near the front laughed out loud. Another muttered, "Brutal." My stepmother didn't stop smiling. She leaned toward a security supervisor and whispered something I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. A man in a black suit approached me. "Miss Holloway," he said softly, "we need you to step outside. You're causing discomfort among the guests." Discomfort. That word almost broke me. I walked past tables filled with people who had once asked for my advice, people who had shaken my hand in private meetings and praised my brilliant mind when no one was watching. Now they avoided my eyes like I was contagious. Behind me, applause rose again. My father had already moved on. My existence was a footnote. Outside, the doors closed. The laughter inside became muffled. The cold air cut through my dress. I stood on the marble steps and finally let myself breathe. What none of them knew, what made the whole thing almost poetic, was that every dollar funding that laughter had come through accounts I controlled. The venue, the production, the champagne, all of it. They laughed because they thought I was powerless. They laughed because they thought I didn't belong. They laughed because they had no idea who I really was. And right there, under the city lights of Manhattan, I understood something with terrifying clarity. My father didn't just underestimate me. He had legally handed me the moment I needed. Before this night was over, everything he built would start unraveling. Quietly, precisely, irreversibly. But before I take you there, let me ask you, where are you listening from right now? What city? What country? Because what happened next didn't stay inside that ballroom. The cold outside the hotel followed me home that night, but it wasn't new. I'd been carrying that kind of cold for most of my life. When people ask when I learned to stay quiet, I never know how to answer. It wasn't a single moment. It was a slow erasing, a gradual lesson taught without words. As a child, I was the one who listened. I noticed patterns before people finished their sentences. I could tell when something didn't add up, even if everyone else nodded along. My mother saw that. She used to sit with me at the kitchen table late at night, scribbling numbers on scrap paper, turning math into a kind of language only we spoke. "Numbers don't lie," she'd whisper. "People do. If you learn to read numbers, you'll never be powerless." She died when I was young, and with her went the only person who spoke my language. After that, the house changed. Not dramatically, quietly. My father remarried, and suddenly the space I occupied became optional. Brandon arrived with noise and charm and stories about how special he was. Teachers praised him for effort. Family friends praised him for confidence. My father praised him for existing. I was praised for staying out of the way. At dinner, I learned to speak only when spoken to. At gatherings, I learned that silence was safer than being wrong, and being wrong was anything that contradicted my father. When Brandon failed an exam, it was because the system didn't understand him. When I excelled, it was because I was obsessive or overcompensating. I watched the rules carefully. They were never written, but they were consistent. Brandon was potential. I was excess. So I stopped trying to be seen. I poured everything into work. Scholarships weren't rewards to me. They were exits. I left early, quietly, with a suitcase full of textbooks and no expectations from anyone. I paid my own way. I learned how markets behaved under pressure, how companies bled money without realizing it, how mistakes hid in plain sight until they became disasters. And while my father bragged about his empire, I watched it wobble. The first time I sent money, I didn't even tell myself the truth about it. I called it temporary, a bridge. North Vale had a liquidity issue tied to a rushed expansion. My father was panicking in private while projecting strength in public. I saw the numbers. I knew exactly how close he was to collapse. So I helped, quietly, through an intermediary, no credit, no acknowledgement. It became a pattern, a bad acquisition Brandon had championed, a loan he'd personally guaranteed and then defaulted on. Legal settlements buried under operational expenses. Every time the company should have fallen, it didn't. Because I stepped in, not as a daughter, as a calculation. I never told them. I never confronted them. I never asked for gratitude. I learned early that gratitude, in that family, came with strings. Silence was cleaner. I watched my bank balance shrink while my father hosted charity galas. I watched Brandon buy cars he didn't earn. I watched my stepmother talk about family loyalty while benefiting from money she didn't know came from me. And the strangest part? I wasn't angry. Anger requires expectation. I had none. What I felt was something colder, more deliberate, a decision to observe, to remember, to keep records. Every transfer, every bailout, every quiet rescue. When people ask why I didn't leave completely, why I didn't cut them off, the answer is simple. I wasn't finished learning yet. I learned how power hides behind confidence. I learned how failure gets forgiven when it's loud enough. I learned how silence makes people underestimate you in the most dangerous way possible. By the time I was recognized publicly as a top financial analyst, my father had no idea. To him, I was still the quiet daughter who worked with numbers, nothing more. That misunderstanding was his greatest comfort and my greatest advantage, because while they believed I was a shadow, I was building something solid. Not to prove myself, not to be accepted, but to make sure that one day, when the silence ended, it would end on my terms. I didn't build my company because I wanted power. I built it because I wanted insulation. After years of watching North Vale wobble under decisions driven by ego instead of data, I realized something unsettling. The empire my father bragged about was far more fragile than anyone knew. It didn't need a revolution to fall. It only needed patience. That was when Aurora Crest Partners began. Not with a launch party, not with press releases, but with a single quiet incorporation document filed under a name no one in my family had ever heard of. I chose the name carefully. Neutral, forgettable, safe. Aurora Crest wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be. I designed it to do one thing exceptionally well: move silently and survive volatility. While others chased attention, I chased inefficiencies. While my father chased applause, I watched the numbers he ignored. The first shares I bought were almost accidental. Northvale stock dipped after one of Richard's bold expansions missed its targets. Analysts shrugged. Investors panicked. I didn't. I knew exactly why the numbers were bleeding. I'd warned him years earlier. He hadn't listened. So I bought. Not in my name. Never in my name. Through layered entities. Through structures designed to look like noise in the market. Small percentages. Spread out. Patient. Every time Northvale stumbled, I was there. Quietly. Methodically. I didn't rush. I let arrogance do its work. What my father never understood was that confidence makes people sloppy. Especially powerful men who believe they're untouchable. 12 years earlier, during one of his private crises, one he pretended didn't exist publicly, he called me late at night. Not as a daughter, as a problem solver. He needed capital fast. Banks were hesitant. Investors were circling. I prepared the paperwork myself. Just standard protection clauses, I told him calmly, sliding the documents across his desk. Nothing that affects you unless something extreme happens. He didn't read them. He never read documents I prepared. That was another rule I learned early. One clause mattered. Just one. I called it the dignity clause. It was simple in wording, elegant, almost boring. It stated that any shareholder above a defined threshold could trigger a governance review if publicly humiliated or formally excluded at an event representing family or company interests. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was legal. He signed. I remember the sound of the pen hitting paper. Final, casual, dismissive. Years passed. Aurora Crest grew. Slowly at first, then steadily. I diversified, learned when to retreat and when to press forward. I made mistakes, but I documented them. I adjusted. I never assumed I was right, just because I wanted to be. Meanwhile, Northvale repeated the same cycle. Overconfidence, poor oversight, damage control disguised as vision. Every dip was an opportunity. Every crisis a discount. I watched my percentage rise without anyone noticing. 5%, 10, 15. The board didn't ask questions. They were too busy nodding at Richard's speeches. By the time the anniversary gala approached, I had crossed a line that changed everything. 32%. I read the confirmation twice. Then, once more. Not because I didn't trust the numbers, but because I respected them. I wasn't excited. I wasn't scared. I felt aligned. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't a weakness. It was leverage. What struck me most wasn't the power itself, but how easily it had been handed to me, not taken. Handed. Through neglect. Through ego. Through the belief that the quiet daughter could never matter. Aurora Crest remained invisible. That was intentional. I didn't need recognition. I needed position. And position, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It waits. By the time my father stepped onto that stage at the Silvermont, mocking me with a microphone and a smile, the truth was already written in filings he'd never read and shares he never noticed disappearing from his grasp. I stood there listening, not because I was powerless, but because I was ready. And for the first time, the silence wasn't about survival. It was about timing. 72 hours after the gala, the building felt different. Northvale's headquarters had always been loud in a quiet way. Expensive silence, controlled movements, people speaking softly because power didn't need volume. That morning, the silence was brittle. Cameras crowded the lobby. Reporters whispered names they didn't fully understand yet. Investors avoided eye contact with each other, reading updates on their phones, sensing something was wrong, but not knowing where the ground would crack. I walked in alone. For the first time, no one tried to stop me. The emergency shareholders meeting had been labeled procedural. That word was a lie. Everyone in that room knew it. You don't call a procedural meeting with global press watching and legal teams lining the walls. I took my seat at the long table as the representative of Aurora Crest Partners. The name finally existed out loud. Heads turned. Some curious, some confused. My father didn't look at me at first. He was busy whispering to Brandon, irritation sharp in his posture. When the chair recognized me, the room stilled. "I'll be brief," I said, because confidence doesn't need decoration. Aurora Crest Partners has been a shareholder of Northvale Holdings for over a decade. A murmur ran through the room. I clicked the remote. The screen behind me lit up with charts. Clean, simple, impossible to argue with. These capital injections, I continued, occurred during periods of financial instability, acquisitions that underperformed, liquidity gaps, emergency refinancing. I paused. They prevented insolvency. My father finally looked up. His face didn't show fear yet, just irritation, the kind that comes before denial. For transparency, I said, here is the cumulative amount Aurora Crest has contributed directly or indirectly to stabilizing North Vale. The number appeared, large, precise. Someone inhaled sharply behind me. I didn't look at my father when I spoke next. I looked at the board. None of these contributions were disclosed publicly, not because they were improper, but because silence was strategically beneficial. Richard stood halfway out of his chair. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "You're implying—" "I'm stating," I corrected calmly, "and now I'm documenting." I changed the slide. The room shifted. This time, it wasn't capital. It was risk exposure, pension funds, employee retirement assets, lines drawn between accounts that should never have touched. These funds, I said evenly, were used as collateral without authorization. They backed high-risk ventures approved without full board consent. The color drained from Brandon's face. A board member spoke, voice tight. "Are you accusing—" "I'm presenting evidence," I said, "and let the documents speak. Signatures, dates, internal emails, not dramatic, just devastating." Then I played the video. My father's voice filled the room, clear, cruel, unmistakable. "She hides behind spreadsheets because she has no personality." No one laughed this time. I watched the room react, not emotionally, but legally. People weren't offended. They were calculating. When the video ended, I didn't rush the moment. Silence is heavier when you let it settle. 12 years ago, I said quietly, during a private refinancing, Mr. Holloway signed a governance amendment. I clicked again. The dignity clause. My father shook his head. That was boilerplate. It was binding, I replied. I read the clause aloud. Slowly, word by word, public humiliation. Exclusion at a family or company representative event. Threshold ownership requirement. Then I looked up. Aurora Crest currently holds 32% of North Vale Holdings. The air changed. You could feel it. The precise moment control left his hands. I am formally invoking the clause, I said. Effective immediately. Phones buzzed. Legal counsel leaned forward. The chair's voice came out tight as he announced a temporary freeze on executive authority pending review. My father didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just stared at me, finally seeing me, not as a daughter, not as a mistake, but as a variable he never accounted for. The board moved quickly after that. Motions, votes, procedures snapping into place like a machine that had been waiting. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain myself. I had already said everything that mattered. When the meeting recessed, cameras rushed forward. Questions collided in the air. I walked past them without stopping, because the truth had already landed. I could have taken everything. That was the irony no one in that room seemed to understand at first. The documents, the votes, the authority now stacked quietly in my favor meant I had options most people only fantasize about. I could have stripped my father of every title, every privilege, every ounce of legacy he clung to. I could have stepped into his chair and let the headlines write themselves. But revenge had never been the point. As the board reconvened, the room no longer felt hostile. It felt cautious, respectful in the way people become when they realize power has shifted permanently. Motions were proposed, seconded, passed. Not emotionally, procedurally, efficiently. Richard Holloway was asked to resign as chairman, effective immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply nodded, the way men do when they understand the fight is already over. Brandon was formally barred from any executive or advisory role within North Vale Holdings. No appeals, no exceptions. Marissa's consulting contracts and affiliated partnerships were terminated, one by one, with language so precise it left no room for interpretation. The family retained passive shares, nothing more. No voting influence, no access, no leverage. An independent leadership team was appointed, temporary at first, then permanent. People chosen not for bloodlines or loyalty, but for competence, for accountability, for restraint. When the chair turned to me and asked if I wished to assume an executive position, the room leaned forward slightly, anticipating the final twist. I shook my head. "I'm not here to replace anyone," I said calmly. "I'm here to make sure no one like this ever runs the company again." There was no applause, just understanding. I gathered my folder, closed it, and stood. For a brief moment, I felt my father watching me, as if waiting for something. Anger, triumph, a speech. I gave him none of it. I walked out. In the hallway, away from cameras and conference tables, the air felt lighter. Not victorious. Clear. Like a chapter had finally ended, without demanding anything more from me. For most of my life, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I thought surviving meant staying quiet, paying the cost, absorbing the damage. But standing there, I understood something that changed everything. You don't win by becoming the thing that hurt you. You win by leaving it behind. I didn't take his chair because I never wanted it. I didn't take his name because I never needed it. The power I reclaimed wasn't financial or legal. It was the freedom to walk away without explaining myself. That was the real end of the Holloway dynasty. Not with headlines, not with scandal, but with absence. Outside, the city moved on. Traffic, voices, life, uninterrupted. I stepped into it without looking back. And if you've listened to this story from the beginning to the end, I want to say this directly to you. If you've ever been told to stay quiet to keep the peace, if you've ever paid the price just to be tolerated, if you've ever been underestimated because your strength didn't look loud enough, you don't owe anyone your silence. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting harder, it's knowing when to leave the room. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. I hope it reminded you of your own strength, even if you're still discovering it. Wherever you're listening from, I wish you a peaceful, warm, and joyful Christmas. And if this story moved you, please like and subscribe to hear more real stories from women who found their power in unexpected ways. You're not alone, and your voice matters.